On tonight's edition of POLITICAT, last harvest, could this be the end of food stamps?
It's here. Infrastructure Week returns.
And trouble in Israel, the Middle East, erupts with violence.
All that and more on POLITICAT. It's your politics right now. Good evening and welcome to POLITICAT. I'm Michelle Beck.
And I'm Justin Sweetwood. We'll get to all of those stories and more, but first, tonight's headlines. The Supreme Court voted on Monday that the law requiring states to ban sports betting is unconstitutional. This paves the way for states to pass legislation legalizing betting on college and professional games. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie has been a vocal advocate against the federal ban. He spoke out on Twitter on Monday after the court announced its decision, saying it is, quote, a great day for the rights of states and their people to make their own decisions.
The U.S. Embassy in Israel officially moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on Monday. Although most of the embassy's staff will remain in Tel Aviv, the symbolic gesture carries a lot of weight. The city of Jerusalem has been the subject of contention between Israelis and Palestinians since the Israeli military captured the city in 1967. The move was met by protests both outside the embassy and in the Gaza Strip, where Israeli forces fired on protesters, killing 60 Palestinians. The number is reported to include women, children, journalists, and first responders.
The Senate will likely confirm Trump nominee Gina Haspel as CIA director after Senate Intel Committee ranking member Mark Warner announced he would support her. Haspel was a controversial pick due to her involvement in a secret Thailand prison that used waterboarding. But in a letter yesterday to Warner, Haspel wrote that the torture method, quote, did damage to our officers and our standing in the world.
2018 marks 5 years since the passing of the Agricultural Act of 2014, more commonly known as the Farm Bill. It's a massive omnibus bill passed every 5 years which regulates the agriculture of the United States. Originally part of FDR's New Deal, the Farm Bill provides a litany of agricultural commodity and trade subsidies, conservation regulations, funding for several different research initiatives, among several other areas. But as the 2018 Farm Bill heads to the House floor this year, one part of the legislation has taken center stage: food stamps. The Farm Bill usually provides funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, often referred to as food stamps. These vouchers help around 44 million Americans living in poverty afford food for their families and cost around $70 billion a year. However, this is a Trump year, and that means changes, or at least attempts to change. The president signed an executive order in April directing the government to impose work requirements on those receiving Medicaid and SNAP or face the loss of such benefits. Now, Republican House Agriculture Chair Mike Conaway is preparing to present a farm bill that would do just that, but it's already facing problems from moderate Republicans who think the work requirements are too strict, as well as conservative Republicans who think they're not strict enough. And here to talk more about the upcoming fight is Edmund Bannister of the NU Political Union and ASG Senator Dylan Doppold. Edmund and Dylan, thank you for joining us. So let's talk work requirements for food stamps. It's something that sounds almost universally awful to those on the left and almost universally great to those on the right. Is there a merit to including a work provision for SNAP benefits? Edmund, let's start with you.
There's not much merit at all. We're talking about basically the most ground level social welfare program in the country. This isn't just something that a person, needs to live a good life. This is something that a person needs, to live at all. And essentially the Republicans are proposing a policy that will mean that millions of people that are currently on food stamps either won't be able to get them at all or will be able to get them at a significantly reduced rate. This is an unbelievably cynical measure by the Republicans, especially because this Farm Bill is a piece of legislation that's very vital. And if you want to pass the entire Farm Bill and they're holding it hostage based on this one food stamp provision, that's a very damaging thing for, obviously the people that are going to lose benefits because of it, but also for, the trust between Democrats and Republicans on this bill, which used to be bipartisan.
And Dylan, what's your take?
Yeah, I completely agree with Edmund. I think that this is kind of part of Paul Ryan's master plan to kind of cut social benefits and do a lot of things that he hasn't been able to do in the past. And even though there is a Republican Congress and a Republican president, he has not had as much success unifying his party and getting Democrats on board as he would have liked. So I think this is kind of one sneaky maneuver to try and make more regulations and limit the social programs in a way that would probably be more viable, but I think even in this case, it's probably not going to happen.
Now, Conaway is already having trouble with Republicans in the House, but the challenge in the Senate is an entirely different story. Senate Agriculture Chair Pat Roberts told Politico that if changes in SNAP benefits stayed in the bill, he would not be able to provide the 60 votes needed to avoid a filibuster, which raises the question, do you think these changes have any chance of actually happening? We'll start with Dylan.
I really don't think so. I think even though Republicans have control in both houses of Congress, that there's really no way for Republicans to unify, especially with Trump's popularity continuing to wane and divisions within the party. You have the Freedom Caucus and then more moderate Republicans who are really worried about their re-election chances in the fall. There's very little possibility of them coming together, and especially once they have to go to the Senate, it's going to be really hard for Republicans to get any bill, let alone such an important bill like the Farm Bill.
I definitely agree with Dylan. I think there's a risk, in this upcoming 2018 congressional race that the Republicans are going to lose a massive number of seats, and that's only going to become more likely if they're seen as being sort of this unbelievably sort of cruel party that cuts food stamps for poor people and working people. I think that this is the type of provision which has the potential to energize the Republican base, but would be very bad for moderate Republicans that are facing, serious election challenges in 2018.
Now, shifting gears a little bit, one of the oldest parts of the Farm Bill has been farm subsidies, intended to encourage new farmers to start farming businesses. Over the years, the upper limit on how big these subsidies are and who qualifies for them has risen significantly. But Conaway's draft eliminates the subsidy cap and allows individuals with incomes of up to $800,000 to qualify. Essentially, what this means is that fewer and larger farm operations can now attract most of the funding meant for independent farmers. Now, is this evidence of corporate cronyism in the Farm Bill, and if so, is it time to look for new solutions to the problems facing our country's agricultural sector? Dylan.
I think this is a perfect example of crony capitalism and the kind of support that the Republican Party has shown to the elite and the 1% in this country. I think we saw back in the winter and fall last year when they passed the tax bill, which did lower taxes for many Americans, but significantly lowered them for the top 1% and the richest Americans. And I think this Farm Bill is a continuation of that pattern. And until things change and until the American people are willing to make these changes, I think this will continue, and it's really a travesty.
I think what's ironic is that a lot of people, consider Republican, rural voters to be an essential part of the Republican base, and they really are. But a lot of Republican plans, especially as it relates to the Farm Bill, don't actually benefit small farmers very much. In fact, oftentimes, and I think this is a perfect example of this, they actually end up hurting and benefiting large agribusinesses instead. So I definitely think that if the Republicans want to keep these voters in their party, they might want to reassess the policies they're implementing.
Now, the House Farm Bill is expected to be introduced on the floor next week, according to Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy. We'll have more PolitiCat after this break.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
Welcome back to PolitiCat. Now it's time for Red, White, and Green, our weekly segment on money and politics. Justin?
Thanks, Michelle. Now, as we mentioned earlier, yesterday the Supreme Court struck down a 1992 federal law that banned commercial sports betting in many states. As it stands, Americans place about $150 billion a year on illegal bets, and that number is obviously expected to rise now that it is legal. It is estimated that more than half of states will offer sports betting within the next half-decade. In Mississippi and West Virginia, gamblers may be able to place bets as soon as this summer, before the football season starts. Proponents argue that it might actually help balance state budgets. Studies have also shown that it contributes over $100 billion annually to the economy and supports over 1 million full-time jobs. But all 4 major U.S. sports leagues and the NCAA do not share the same sentiment, claiming that gambling hurts the integrity of their games and they would have to devote resources to monitor betting and suspicious activities. On the contrary, billionaire Dallas Mavericks owner Mark Cuban disagrees, saying that the major sports team owners just saw, quote, the value of their team double and how it can finally become fun to go to a baseball game again. NBA Commissioner Adam Silver also previously voiced his support for sports betting. Several casino companies have had their worths increase, including Caesars Entertainment, which was up 6%, and Penn National Gaming, up 4%. Back to the desk.
Thanks, Justin. And now to the news on Infrastructure Week. It's that time of year again. May 14th to the 21st has been declared the 6th annual Infrastructure Week by private, not-for-profit organization infrastructureweek.org. The plan would have the federal government spending about $200 billion over 10 years to encourage an ideal $1.5 trillion in state, local, and private investment. The country's antiquated roads, bridges, electrical grid, and water system are in dire need of repair. The public first began hearing about this last June when President Trump first hinted at an infrastructure plan. But that Infrastructure Week was overshadowed by James Comey's dismissal. 2 later Infrastructure Weeks in August and in February were also overlooked in favor of the Charlottesville white supremacist protest, Stormy Daniels, and the Parkland shooting. The never-ending Infrastructure Week has become somewhat of a meme. But should we be paying attention more to the slow breakdown of our infrastructure?
Yeah, I really think we need to be. I think some of the most important places where our infrastructure is failing people in America is in inner cities and is in places that Trump and Republican administration has really shown that they really don't care about and that they are fighting in pretty much every single way. So I really think we need to get on the infrastructure, but given the administration's stances on cities where it's really the most important, I don't think we're going to see any progress made.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Dylan. I think this is an incredibly serious problem. It's estimated that the United States is going to lose $4 trillion in potential GDP growth up to 2025 because our infrastructure is so outdated. You know, bridges are rotting and collapsing, railways aren't being repaired, roads aren't being repaired, necessary improvements aren't being made, and all this needs to change by, you know, really decisive government action on both the state and federal level. The current spending bill is relatively minimal in the amount of funds it directly allocates, so I'm not sure if it's going to be enough.
Now, on May 9th, White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders announced that the Trump administration's 2018 infrastructure plan would not turn out a, quote, specific piece of legislation. The White House first began foreshadowing an infrastructure plan in January 2017 and released the 53-page document in February 2018. Now, 17 months from the starting point, why there might not be any legislation, and what does this mean for the president and Congress?
Well, I think this administration has a lot on its plate, and almost none of it has anything to do with passing meaningful legislation. I think that the legislation that has been proposed, which is $200 billion, it is really woefully inadequate. The Trump administration claims that there's going to be $1.5 trillion of subsequent investment that this initial $200 billion is going to trigger. That's basically the most optimistic estimate possible you can make, without sort of completely ignoring the math of it altogether. I think that the proposal that the Democrats have made, which is actually $1 trillion of direct spending, is really closer to what the United States needs to fix this problem.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that the Democrats' plan is probably the most efficient way to address a lot of the infrastructure problems that we're facing. And I think that one of the reasons that the Republicans are just unable to make any meaningful legislation, let alone even come up with ideas for something like this, is just because I think they thought it was going to be a lot easier to unify following Trump's election. I think it was a shock to everybody, and even when there were problems within the party, everybody more or less came around to supporting Trump. But within Congress, you still have moderate Republicans who are very wary to do anything conservative, and you have the Freedom Caucus, who is still hardline conservative even to the right of Trump. So I think they really need to work on unifying the party a little bit more before they can do anything meaningful.
All right, thank you, Dylan, and we'll have more PolitiCat after the break.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Northwestern. Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all to go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
Welcome back to PolitiCat. Let's go to David Gernon for this week's 2-in-1. David?
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome to the 2-in-1. Politics and Policies look at two stories that deserve more attention and one that deserves a little less. We're going to focus on Malaysia today, which held elections last Wednesday. Ever since Malaysia gained independence from Britain in the mid-1950s, one group has dominated the country's politics, the United Malays National Organization, or UNMO. Accordingly, every prime minister has been a member of UNMO. The party had been increasingly working to rig the past few elections, so few expected Wednesday's election to result in anything other than another UNMO victory. But miraculously, the opposition coalition won a parliamentary majority and right to lead the country. The coalition is led by the new Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad. Mahathir was a 5-term Prime Minister for UNMO before being ousted by his scandal-prone protege, Najib Razak, who was the Prime Minister until last week. 92-year-old Mahathir is not exactly a breath of fresh air, given his decades in charge of the country, but during the campaign he promised to resign once his rival opposition leader, Anwar Ibrahim, is released from prison and can take over. It remains to be seen if the somewhat mismatching parties making up the PH coalition can get much done, but this represents the first transfer of power in the country's history and firmly puts the power of choosing a government back into the hands of Malaysian voters. Now turning stateside, California's Energy Commission has voted to require all new homes built to have solar power, either through panels on the roof or with a group of homes sharing a solar power system nearby. California is the first state in the nation to have such a mandate, and the long-term effects of this policy are unclear. The decision is expected to add anywhere from $8,000 to $12,000 to the cost of new homes, and critics say the raised cost makes little sense in a state with already scarce affordable housing. Supporters argue the energy savings are worth the initial financial hardship. California already leads the nation when it comes to green energy, and this is a further step in that direction at a time when the federal government's attitude towards clean energy is ambivalent, to say the least. For a story that has been getting too much attention, we turn towards last week's primaries in West Virginia. Former coal executive and convicted felon Don Blankenship finished third in the state's Republican primary for U.S. Senate. But if you had been watching media coverage in the weeks leading up to the vote, you would have been forgiven to think Blankenship was the clear frontrunner. Such was the disparity in media coverage. Most of this coverage focused on Blankenship's outlandish and racist ads and campaign comments, so after Blankenship began his rise in the polls, journalists all across the Beltway asked the question, why is he gaining so much momentum? Then they asked that question 5 more times on 15 other media platforms. While it is a relief to see Blankenship come in third place, it was disappointing to witness him get so much undeserved media attention. Shining a light in dark places is important journalistic work, but doing so just for offensive spectaculars does no one any favors. That's all for us this week. Be sure to check out politicsandpolicy.org for more. Back to you, Justin.
Thanks, David. And turning our attention to a volatile week in the Middle East, on Monday, nearly 3,000 Palestinians were injured and 60 were killed along the border fence with Gaza in a mass protest over the right to return lands Palestinians were removed from in 1948. Protests have been ongoing since March 30th, but this one occurred at the same time as the relocation of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Israeli authorities defended the use of force by pointing to many instances in which protesters hurled rocks and burning tires at security forces. Meanwhile, the country is also taking action elsewhere, conducting airstrikes on Iranian military bases in Syria. The U.S. had previously backed Israel last week, saying it had the right to defend itself from the threat of Iranian aggression. Now, this exchange came just days after President Trump announced that the country was leaving the Iran deal, and has raised the question: is Israel, or the U.S. for that matter, Dylan, provoking tensions with Iran?
I do. I think they are intentionally trying to provoke conflict with Iran. I think that Israel, for all of its claims for wanting peace with Palestinians, with a lot of the people in the Middle East, I think Israel thrives with conflict. I think that they really need an enemy constantly within the Middle East in order to kind of continue their power expansion and continue with their security initiatives in the area. And I think that Iran going into Syria and helping Hezbollah in the area is really helpful to Israel to continue with their current path.
I disagree a little bit. I think that the Israelis have a legitimate security concern that there are Revolutionary Guard forces in Syria, that a lot of these forces have missiles that are capable of attacking Israel, and that they have on multiple occasions actually launched rockets across the border. I think that the Israelis have a right to respond to that. I don't necessarily think that the Israelis are trying to do anything more than defend their immediate area around their borders. Other than that, I don't really see a whole lot of scheming on the part of Israel on this issue.
Okay, now Dylan, looking back at the Israel-Gaza border from a PR kind of perspective, the reaction to the protests have been a major loss. Is Israel hurting itself more than it's helping?
I think it really depends on where you look. Within Israel, I think any sort of ethno-religious conflict, or really anywhere in the world, is a really good way to kind of stoke a nationalist fervor. And I think despite Netanyahu's problems, he's very popular within Israel. But when you look broader across the world, among Western media, Jewish community all over, I think Israel really is losing the PR battle. As somebody who identifies as Jewish, who has been to Israel and really appreciates the culture and everything that goes on there, I find it harder and harder to call myself a Zionist when the Israeli government continues to oppress Palestinians like this.
I think that obviously the reaction within Israel to this incident is going to be mixed, as it always is. Israel is a democracy. They have multiple different parties with different political viewpoints, from the very far right Zionists to people that are further on the left. I think that they do have a serious PR problem. The Israeli military shot 60 people dead during these protests, which would probably more accurately be called riots. But even in riot conditions, there are ways of handling that situation without resorting to lethal force, and the Israelis really need to find a way of doing that. Otherwise, they're going to have a serious diplomatic crisis on their hands.
Edmund, how does the U.S. factor into all of this? Should they be mingling in international affairs?
I think that the Israelis already consider Jerusalem to be their capital, and they've had all their government ministries in Jerusalem for a very, very long time, for many decades now. I think the United States, by moving its embassy there, is really recognizing something that already exists on a de facto level. That being said, I think that the United States could do more to appear neutral in this conflict. If we really want to try to facilitate a two-state solution or reach some sort of peace deal, we have to have good faith from both sides of the aisle, and that's very difficult to do when we're seen as backing every single thing Israel does completely unconditionally. We should always, with our allies, tell them to exercise restraint where we think that's appropriate, and this is one of those times.
Dylan, is this one of those times where they need to exercise restraint?
Yeah, I really think they do. Israel has constantly way overstepped its bounds when it comes to protecting its borders, and I think that the U.S. has continued to allow this under both Democratic and Republican administrations. Obama also sent a lots of military aid to Israel, and I think that without proper criticisms coming from much more official places like the U.S. government and other Western powers, I think that Israel will continue to overstep its bounds and really not further the peace process in any meaningful way.
Okay, Dylan, let's stay with you. What does this all mean for the immediate future of the entire Middle East? In Israel alone, the protests on the Gaza Strip, Gaza border contributed to one of the bloodiest days in years.
Yeah, I think it's really a grim time for peace prospects. I think that the move to Jerusalem while in some people's eyes was just seen as kind of inevitable thing, I think that it is very harmful to the peace process. And I think that as long as Trump is in power and the Republicans are in power, I don't see much progress being made. But I did see one interesting argument online that the Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem could possibly make it a lot easier for a future Democratic president to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine as well. So I think long term there is hope, even with Trump's controversial moves, but right now I don't see any peace process going forward right now.
Okay, and Edmund, your final thoughts.
I mean, I would say that the Israelis have occupied all of Jerusalem since 1967, and they've occupied West Jerusalem since 1948. They consider it to be their capital, and they have complete military control over it. And there's really nothing that the United States is going to do or any other country can do to reverse that sort of condition. So I think that any peace negotiation going forward is really not going to have Jerusalem on the table, because the Israelis simply aren't going to put it there, and no one can force them to put it there. So I really think at this point it's about getting the Palestinians and the Israelis to mutually recognize facts as they exist on the ground and basically reach a peace agreement on that basis. But we'll see if this can happen under the current administration. I doubt it's going to happen under the Trump administration.
Yeah, all right, thank you to you both. Stay with us for the final word.
At Northwestern, we're Wildcats in every way.
Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, spread for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
And now for the final word. The views expressed in this segment are not necessarily the views of NNN or Northwestern University. They are the views of the POLITICAT editorial staff. On Friday, a White House aide made national headlines when she made a remark about Senator John McCain. Kedley Sadler said of the 80-year-old senator fighting brain cancer that his opposition to the president's pick for CIA director doesn't matter because, quote, he's dying anyway. According to this White House official, Sadler said this in a meeting as a joke. This situation here is a great example of the role that the media is currently playing as it attempts to bring objective truth but also inserts its own moral judgments. Let's look at how. First, the fact that the media has talked about the simple comment, inappropriate but not new to the administration, throughout the entire weekend. That suggests that the media thinks something is different this time, that it's wrong. The media's judgment of how wrong the situation is affects the way news consumers see it. We also see the media acting as a moral guide in the way it provides context. Vox Media contextualizes its 900-plus word story with statements such as, quote, President Trump and Senator McCain have a fraught relationship. Vox also cites McCain's close friend Senator Lindsey Graham on the White House's response to the situation, quote, it doesn't hurt you at all to do the right thing and to be big. We're not just reporting a story about saying this White House aide said this, but in the way that we provide context, the media does the interpreting for the reader or viewer. Journalists have a social responsibility to not finish the story with a senseless quote. If we do leave it at just that, we allow the viewers to believe that what Sadler said is true and that it's valid. And so we feel like we have to guide our viewers and make them believe what we're believing, providing context, which is something that the media must do to provide truth in the best way. But by doing so, we're trailing off from seeking the purest form of truth that we so pride ourselves on. We admit it's a slippery slope, and that's something we'll be watching out for.
All right, thanks, Michelle. And that's our show for tonight. Thank you to our guests, Edmund Bannister and Dylan Doppold. We'll be here back next week on POLITICAT.